Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for today's video. I'm going to be doing the eyeshadow tag part 2 that Samantha March and Allie Glines just collabed on. If you are not new to my channel, you know I love making palette themed content. So I was super excited to see this one, and I thought it would be the perfect video to be my first video to film in my new space, my new apartment. I know I mentioned quite a few times on my channel that I'm going through a lot in my personal life, and I finally have a space to call my own, which I'm super excited for. It's been a little bit since I filmed, and obviously this is my first video filming in this space, so I'm not sure like lighting wise or echo wise how things are gonna go, and I also feel just like a little bit just like getting back into the groove of things. But I'm very excited to, 1, be filming in this new space, 2, get back to filming for my channel, and 3, super excited to be doing the eyeshadow tag part 2. So all of the questions will be linked down below, as well as Samantha and Allie's videos. And I know a bunch of people have already uploaded their version of this as well, so you can always search the eyeshadow palette tag, and you can also look at the previous eyeshadow palette tag, which was a fun one to do. I'll also leave my old eyeshadow palette tag video down below, as well as my palette playlist, in case you like palette themed content. Other than that, if you have not yet subscribed to my channel and you like project panning content or palette themed content like this, I would love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay guys, like I said in the introduction, I will have all of the prompts and questions down in my description box down below in case you too want to either answer these questions in my comments. I would love to hear your guys' responses, or if you want to do this tag as well. But the first question is your all-time favorite palette, and for me I had to go with Samantha's answer for this as well. I was debating between this palette and the ABH Jackie palette, but when I look at the palettes and which ones have more pans in them and which one I reach for more often, I had to go with the ABH Sultry palette. I just absolutely love this palette, and year after year I continue to reach into this palette all of the time. It continues to be one of my most used eyeshadow palettes each year, so I had to go with this one. I currently have 4 eyeshadow pans in this palette, and I would love to see some more in this one by the end of the year. It's just such an easy to use palette. It's beautiful. I love the mattes, I love the shimmers, and this is definitely an all-time favorite palette of mine. Next up is a new favorite palette, and for me I had to go with the Glamlight Chocolate Martini palette. It's funny because when this like drink line released from Glamlight, the palette I was first initially interested in was the Dirty Martini one. Yeah, the Dirty Martini one with the like the green themed palette, and then I had talked myself out of getting the palettes all together, and I cannot remember who it was. I think it may have been Lauren from Lauren May Beauty, who I saw review or do a demo with the Chocolate Martini palette, and I think the Dirty Martini palette, and I decided that I had to purchase this Chocolate Martini palette. First of all, there's a ton of neutral shades. I knew I could get use out of this on a day-to-day basis, but in person there's actually a lot more depth and a lot more variety to this palette, and I just think it's a really fun one, really easy to use. I continue to find myself wanting to reach for this, and I've created some of my favorite looks of last year. Obviously we're very new into 2022, but some of my favorite eyeshadow palette looks that I created in 2021 we're using this palette. So this is definitely a new favorite of mine. I continue to be impressed with the Glamlight eyeshadow formula, and if you have not checked out Glamlight in general or the Chocolate Martini palette, I highly recommend. All right, the next prompt is a palette that you keep for the memories, and if you guys missed it, I recently posted my updated palettes on their last hurrah like introduction or series, which is essentially kind of like a chopping block palette. And in that video I included the palette I'm about to talk about, and I said I really need to declutter this palette, but I just cannot get myself to do it because I have so many memories tied to this palette, and it is the ABH Mario palette. This palette is so old in my collection. It has a lot of pan, it's gotten a lot of love from me, and I just cannot get myself to declutter this palette, even though I know how old it is and it's really time for this palette to go. But this is a palette that I purchased when I was really first getting into makeup. I did not have a large eyeshadow palette collection at the time, and I remember I was at like a Macy's of all places, and I think I went to purchase maybe the Modern Renaissance palette, and when I was there I saw this palette on display, but it looked to be out of stock, like they only had the display palette, And normally I'm not the type of person to ever ask a sales associate if they can check in the back for anything. But I remember saying to the sales associate, like, oh, are you actually out of stock of that palette, or do you have anything in the back? And she went and she checked and she had it in stock. So I felt like it was fate and I had to get this palette. It wasn't one that was even like initially on my radar to purchase, but I have loved this palette ever since. So this is one that is very old and I really should declutter. It's like it's very, very well loved. I can't get myself to declutter it just for the memories. The next prompt is an underrated palette, and I really struggled with this one because I was like, oh, I feel like I don't know what to talk about. Like I could choose like an indie palette, and I feel like a lot of my like other palettes are like not necessarily underrated. I thought about talking about the Artist Couture palettes, but then I was like, I feel like those like get some hype. So I decided to go with the Nabla Cutie palettes. I feel like Nabla is best known for their side-by-side eyeshadow palettes, but I feel like I don't hear a lot of people talk about the Cutie palettes all that often, and I really like these. I wish that the packaging was a little bit slimmer, but I love a good just curated 6-pan or small palette like this, and I love the Nabla eyeshadow formula in general. So the two that I grabbed were the Nabla Platinum and the Nabla Analog. I just think they're really fun, really curated neutral palettes that I just absolutely adore, and I don't hear enough people talking about these, so I had to include these. The shimmer formula from Nabla is so good, and I also feel like Nabla just has a good variety of formulas. Like it's not just mattes and shimmers. They have a good variety of textures and stuff throughout their eyeshadow formulas and eyeshadow palettes, so I wanted to include those. Next up is a palette that's not a fave, but you can't get rid of, and for me that is the Pat McGrath Sublime palette. I feel like every time I look at my eyeshadow palette collection and think about palettes that I like want to declutter, like if I'm in a decluttering mood, I'll always side-eye this palette, but I just can never get myself to actually declutter this. One, probably because it's Pat McGrath. This was, I believe, the first Pat McGrath palette that I ever purchased. It was limited edition. You can't get this one anymore. I was super disappointed in this blue shimmer shade. It's kind of like the reason I purchased this palette, but I feel like this is the most disappointing shade in the entire palette. I will say I still think like the matte browns are very wearable and easy to use, easy to work with, and I absolutely love these two like shimmer metallic special shades, if you will, which is why I keep the palette around. I just don't reach into this palette all that often, probably not enough to justify keeping it, although I could say that about a plethora of palettes in my collection, but this is definitely one that every time I do a palette declutter, I always think about decluttering this, but I just cannot get myself to actually go through with it. So I thought this was the perfect palette to fit that question. Next up is my favorite collab palette in my collection, and for that I had to go with the Kaleidos Club Nebula palette in collaboration with Angie. I absolutely adore this palette. I think it's so beautiful and so unique and just very colorful, and not something like anything else in my collection. I love this row on the bottom, the like reds and oranges, and I just absolutely love all of the metallic shimmers throughout this palette. I will say I am pretty intimidated by like this top row specifically, but it's fun to reach into when you want to get outside of your comfort zone, and Angie has a ton of great tutorials on her channel using this palette, so definitely most unique and favorite collab in my collection. Next up is my favorite palette from 2021, and for me I just grabbed both of my Artist Couture palettes. So the Supreme Nudes I purchased at the end of 2020, but didn't get to trying it until 2021, and then the Supreme Bronze I actually did purchase in 2021, and I absolutely adore this palette. I love the Artist Couture packaging and I love the formula. I love the color story probably in the Supreme Nudes just a little bit more because you get that brown shade, and I just love the neutrals in this, but I also love the like fiery, sultry, warm brown shades in the Supreme Bronze palette. I think both are just phenomenal quality, phenomenal palettes, and definitely favorites from 2021 for me. Next up is a palette I didn't expect to love, and for me that was the Colourpop Limoncello palette. This is not a palette I purchased on launch day, and I kind of like went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to purchase this palette. I liked the color story, but I also felt like I had the color story for the most part throughout my collection, so I just felt like it wasn't necessarily adding much value to my eyeshadow palette collection. But nevertheless, I did end up purchasing this palette, and I really did come to love this palette. Even past like testing this palette out to kind of share my review, I kept wanting to reach for this palette anytime I traveled or like went over overnight to like my mom's house, I would always bring this palette with me just because it's so wearable and so easy to use. But you still have some fun pops of like neutral color, if you will, with like the yellows and this fun like shimmery green. I absolutely adore this palette, and I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. Next up is a palette that sparks joy, and for me that is the Mercury Retrograde palette by Huda Beauty. This was possibly this was one of the more expensive palettes I had purchased at the time that I initially purchased this palette. I purchased this right when this released. I had really started to get into like astrology, and Mercury Retrograde was something I had just been learning about right before this palette released. And if you guys don't know, people claim that Mercury Retrograde causes chaos, a little bit more chaos, and some people won't make like big decisions in their life during Mercury Retrograde because it's this idea of like chaos, if you will. And I always joke that I like to live my life in constant chaos or constant like Mercury Retrograde. So there's just like a lot of little ties to it. I also love this palette. I just think the shimmers in here are so fun, but like almost like a neutral pop and play with color. Like it's still a very wearable palette in my opinion, and one that I just get really excited when I reach for it and when I create looks with it. So this is definitely a palette that sparks a lot of joy when I reach for this. Next up is the newest palette to my collection, and I don't think I've purchased any palettes yet in 2022, which is crazy and saying something for me. But right at the tail end of 2021, this palette finally came back in stock and I had to pick it up. It's the Patrick Ta Major Dimension eyeshadow palette. I have not yet even used this eyeshadow palette, and I'm very excited to finally dip into it. I was going to use it today, but then I decided to use some of my Panos eyeshadows palettes instead. But I plan to use this baby tomorrow, and I'm so excited about this. I know it's just like a neutral palette, but everybody, I feel like the people that I watch at least, have raved about the quality in this eyeshadow palette and just created such fun and beautiful looks with it. I feel like it'll become really a staple palette, kind of like the Sultry. It's like the Sultry, the Soft Glam, the Nabla side by side. It gives me those vibes, and I'm very, very excited to have this palette in my collection and to start getting some use out of it. And then the final prompt is the first palette that you use in 2022, and I have two palettes that I used first in 2022, and it's the Kaleidos Sashimi City palette as well as the Huda Beauty Wild Tiger palette, which is, I believe, the same palette as like the Lunar Beauty Huda palette at Sephora, but it's just like repackaged in red packaging. This is what the tiger looks like. I actually really love this palette. I think it's so beautiful. I love this center shade. It's kind of like a duochrome pink to gold shade, and I think it's so pretty. So I paired that with my Kaleidos Sashimi City palette, another palette that I absolutely love. I love the Kaleidos eyeshadow formula, and I love the two shimmer shades in this. So I just paired these two palettes together to create a look, and that's actually the only time I've done my eyeshadow, with the exception of today, so far in 2022. So I need to get it together, start doing my makeup more, but I have a feeling that I definitely will be, and I'm very excited about that. But after that is going to conclude my version of the palette round 2 tag by Samantha March and Allie Glines. I hope that you guys enjoyed. I would love to hear some of your responses in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.